at the Division of Perceptual Studies in the School of Medicine at the University of Virginia. We are a group of psychiatrists, psychologists, and neurobehavioral scientists who explore phenomena of consciousness.
For more than 50 years, we bring a rigorous scientific methodology to bear on the study of near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, very young children who remember their past lives, and related phenomena that bear on the question of the relationship between the mind and the physical brain.
Between the near-death experiences and the past life memory reports, we have thousands of cases coded in databases.
This large collection of data allows us to look for trends and patterns within each type of phenomenon.
We've established a high-quality EEG lab here. We're interested in states of consciousness that have by and large been ignored by contemporary psychology and neuroscience.
I've seen the impact of people discovering a different way of thinking about their consciousness, and it is transformational.
Building on the past 50 years of research into these phenomena, we're now asking new questions and diving deeper into the data.
We ask big questions.
Is it possible that consciousness continues on after we die?
Are there ways to alter consciousness that will improve your quality of life?
And if so, what does that mean for us as human beings?
Are certain personality types more likely to report these unusual experiences?
If we ignore these phenomena, then we risk having an incomplete understanding not just of ourselves, but of the ultimate nature of consciousness.
And these are the questions that we're willing to tackle.
We're really just getting started.
We have here two distinguished professors of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences from the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. DOPS is one of the oldest and most established programs at an academic center like the University of Virginia, and they explore a wide range of issues, looking at everything from near-death experiences to after-death communication to what that tells us about the world we live in. And this kind of work, I think, it makes the world a more interesting place. In addition, I want to say that Jim is a child psychiatrist, and one of his longtime research interests is the past lives of children. And DOPS has studied thousands of cases of this, and I'm going to come back to him to talk about this. And Kim is a professor and a clinical psychologist. She has an appointment in UVA's Cancer Research Center. She works with dying patients. And she also explores issues of things like after-death communication, how we access those. Are there techniques we can use to be more connected, and how that helps us during the sort of passage of dying. What I'd like to do now is ask Jim to give us an overview of his research, and then talk about not only his research, but near-death experiences, because that's such another fascinating part of this program.
All right, thank you, Deborah. So, as Deborah said, my area of interest involves young children who say that they have memories of a past life. And we have been studying such cases from all over the world for over 50 years. And what these typically involve is very young children, 3 or 4 years old, who start saying that they remember things that they did in their last life. 70% of them will describe how they died, which is often traumatically. And they, at times, can give very specific details that then we try to verify match somebody who did actually live and die. So there's a well-known American case of a little boy who said he had been a World War II pilot and named the ship that his plane flew off of, talked about where he died, talked about a friend named Jack Larson who was on the ship with him, and all of these things matched with the pilot who was killed in World War II. So those are the kinds of cases that we focus on because they provide evidence that it's not just a child talking about all sorts of fanciful things, but very specific details that, again, we can see, all right, is it really a past life that he or she is describing? The children also have a lot of behaviors that will fit with their memories. Many of them grieving being away from their previous families. They may cry and beg on a daily basis for their parents to take them to their previous family. They'll also show behavior like phobias related to the mode of death from the past life. They'll show things in their play that seem connected. So all of this would suggest that it's not just sort of information that they're accessing, but more that feelings and emotions seem to have carried over, and that it is not just information, but memories that they seem to be bringing with them into this life. So that's one area that we have focused on a lot, looking at this question of life after death, or in this case, sort of life before this life. And as Deborah mentioned, near-death experiences have also been a large focus of our work. Bruce Grayson, who you saw in the video, is one of the world's leading experts on near-death experiences. For people who aren't familiar with those, often when somebody has a heart attack or something that causes them to briefly, their brains to shut down, many of them will describe floating above their bodies. They may witness the resuscitation efforts. Sometimes they will describe things that took place in other parts of the hospital that are then, say, conversations that are then verified to have actually taken place. Then many of them will go through sort of a dark passage. They may say it's a tunnel. They will often encounter deceased loved ones, occasionally ones that they did not know had died. So there are cases where, say, a sibling was killed in a car accident before word got back to the family. Somebody had a near-death experience and was surprised to see their sibling on the other side. Many of them will also have a life review, and then they will often encounter a light or a being of light, which many people interpret as God. And then many of them will hit come to the point of no return. Either they, if they go further, then they will die, and they will often either be given a choice to come back or told they have to come back, that their life is not finished. So then those people do come back and tell us these stories. And if you follow them along, this experience is completely transformative for them. They say that they have lost all fear of death because they know that life continues, and that for most of them it's been a very pleasant experience. And it also transforms how they live this life, which in some ways is real key. They become much less materialistic. They often become sort of more caring, in some ways less ambitious at times, and they go on with their lives, but they are often not the same people that they were before.
And that leads us directly to your research, Kim. I wish you would talk a little bit about your work with after-death communications, and also that also tends to affect the living after that experience. So the stage is yours.
All right, I want to be sure you can hear me. Well, I've got a lapel mic. Can you hear me okay? All right, I could do the double duty if you want, like belts and suspenders. Okay, we're good. I want to say, first of all, thank you for being here. We had no idea. This is a huge room, and we had no idea if we'd have like 2 or 3 people. It's wonderful to see everyone. Before I start, I am just really curious. I'm assuming some of you might be here because you've had some sort of extraordinary experience. So would you mind, if you don't mind, raising your hand if you've had some sort of extraordinary experience, what you would call extraordinary, in your death experience and after-death communication, an out-of-body experience? Okay, so yeah, good. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, you're with your people. That's good. I am a clinical psychologist and really came to this work through my clinical work, working with patients and families who are dying, who are very, or mentally really struggling, and discovered things that I couldn't explain as a scientist from my traditional training. And one that comes to mind that really got me interested in the after-death communications was a woman with cancer I was treating. She had very severe depression, and then her mother passed away. She had a very complicated relationship with her mother and literally got back to her native country to see her right before she died, and was grieving terribly and was having what we call complicated bereavement, really having a hard time letting go. Everything I tried sort of failed. She was really struggling. I was very worried about her. And then she had an experience that she reported to me of her mother coming to her, stroking her cheek as she cried, and telling her she was okay. It was all okay. She felt safe enough to share this with me. I felt so honored. I believed her. It was obviously real to her and real enough to make a significant change in her life. Her depression symptoms improved and stayed improved. And she was able to work through the grief of her mother and that complicated relationship very quickly and thoroughly, and to this day is still doing well. So this got me very interested in what was going on, and I began to get involved in studying after-death communications. So these are literally, what I'm talking about when I say after-death communications are spontaneous contact from people who are deceased. So this is a little different than going to a medium or using a Ouija board or something. This is sort of someone contacting a living person who has passed away. And when we started looking at this, I started looking at the literature. There's not a lot of literature. The literature out there, though, shows that almost half of us have these experiences. I mean, that's a lot of people to not have much research on it. And so I started collaborating with researchers worldwide, and we just completed one of the biggest studies asking people to report their after-death communications. So this was in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French, and people volunteered their stories about their after-death communication. And believe me, these people were dedicated because they filled out about 200 questions about their information. And what we discovered is exactly what Deborah was talking about, is not only do these happen pretty frequently, so we're talking people feel the presence of the loved one who's passed on or the deceased person. It doesn't have to be a loved one, it is just a deceased person. They feel their presence, they're touched by them physically, they smell them, they can sometimes see them, they have this experience. And it can be waking, it can be in a dreamlike state. They're often happening when you're sort of like falling asleep or sort of starting to wake up. Very significantly though, exactly what happened with my patient, we see happening again and again with these people, that this is very therapeutic, that people come out of this experience believing that this was real, believing that their loved one still existed on some plane or some realm, and uniformly these experiences are reassuring, they are restorative for the individual, and as Jim was saying, they also help people lose their fear of death and dying, as you can imagine. And often what we found in our research, people become more spiritual, and they certainly increase their beliefs that we live on after the death of our body. So this is the work that I'm doing and continue to do. I've also done research in meditative states and contemplative practices because I'm very interested in the near-death studies as well as the children who remember past lives. But not all of us have those experiences. In fact, far more of us have after-death communications, but even more of us may be able to achieve some sort of altered state of consciousness through contemplative practices. By this I mean meditation, psychedelic assisted sort of altered consciousness. So there are other ways we may be able to learn more about what happens when our body dies. And I'm very excited about those for the future.
So I'm going to jump in. I mentioned that I'm a science journalist who wrote a book about ghost hunting. And I'm going to jump in and tell you the experience from, not mine, but from my family that kind of got me interested in this topic, which was my father-in-law, who was a small businessman in California, and is Norwegian American, very grounded guy. At least that's his persona. But he, one night he wakes up, it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, sits up in bed so abruptly that he wakes my mother-in-law up and says to her, my cousin Bob's out in the yard. And she sits up, they both listen, it's silent, right? She says to him, you're just dreaming. He lies back down, and about 10 minutes later, he's back up again, and he says, no, I can hear him calling my name. And he goes out in the dark, in the middle of the night, and there's no one there. He's like disturbed a few very unhappy birds, but there's no one there. And so he gets back in bed, and they have one of those, was that the chili conversations, and he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning he goes to work, and he's still just off. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, the son of his cousin Bob called him. Bob lived in Santa Cruz, about several hundred miles away. And Bob had committed suicide almost to the minute that he was out in the yard looking for his cousin. And that kind of experience, if you asked my father-in-law and said, what do you think that was? He would say, I don't know, right? He was mostly just freaked rather than comforted. And so one of the things I want to raise by also telling that story, which is a slightly different version of these kind of experiences, is in either case, in the story that Kim told and the story that I told, in the way that Jim looks at children who may interact with, in some way, with people who previously lived, we're talking about a consciousness that appears to be separate from your brain, right? Or a communication that is not just, I'm telling you this because I'm standing next to you. And I'm wondering if both of you could address that issue a little. There's mind, there's brain, there's consciousness. Do we see them as separate things when you are doing these studies? What do you think you're finding, essentially?
Well, I think we're finding that, yes, they can function separately. And the kind of experience that your father-in-law had called a crisis apparition, I mean, there are hundreds of those cases reported. So it's not just a one-off. I mean, that it happens.
It does happen.
And, that's when the person who is dying, their consciousness is separated from their brain. And then also, somehow, it's conveyed to the living person.
And do we think of that as a kind of telepathy, Jim? Or do we think of it as something more?
Well, it's more in the sense that it's coming from a non-functioning brain, whereas with telepathy, and there have been a lot of studies with telepathy, I mean, there's something going on beyond the brain, from brain to brain, in some sort of link we don't know, but at least both brains are functioning. Whereas this is even more evidence that mind is happening while the brain has ceased to function.
And do you agree with that, Kim?
Well, this gets into all kinds of metaphysical theories, and that's part of what we are exploring. So we consider ourselves scientists, and we go in with an open mind, looking at what are the implications of the work we do. I think Jim would agree with that as well. We really come in looking for evidence and then follow the evidence where it takes us. And from my point of view, I might not have said this, 20 or 30 years ago. After the research I've done, though, it's very clear to me that the mind and the brain are not the same. And I think also it's quite clear to me that the brain does not just produce the mind. And when I say mind, I mean the consciousness that we're talking about. You can think of it as a soul or as your essence. So what exactly is the relationship? We're still trying to find out. I'm very excited about the developments in more theoretical and applied physics, looking at quantum and physics and exploring that. I wish I could go back and get a PhD in physics. I don't want to tell, my husband's in the room, so he might be like, no. So I think there is a lot more research to do, and that's good for my career. I have a long way to go. In the work I've done so far, my hunch is that there's two ways to sort of think of where we are now. That maybe they're separate, mind and body, and there's sort of two entities sort of working. There's also something called the filter theory, where whatever that consciousness is sort of entering into our body, and our brain is sort of like the filter. So there's a way more out there, but we just can't see it. Just like some people who colorblind can't see certain colors, our brain is filtering out things. There's also something called panpsychism, which is that really mind is everywhere. And so I don't have the answer. I mean, we've been struggling for thousands of years with this question. I'm just excited to do the work, follow the evidence, and see where we go.
No, that's really helpful. Did you want to add anything, James?
Well, I was just going to, with the filter theory, William James, of course, that was the star of your book, had this idea, which is now called the filter theory, but where consciousness exists elsewhere, and our brains serve as filters, or as he said, like prism, where it comes through into this reality, but is also existing outside of this reality.
Yes, one of the arguments he made was that our brains do filter out a lot of, free-floating information, because you just don't want to be constantly bombarded. It's adaptive. And that something like the experience that I mentioned with my father-in-law, the blast of energy is so much stronger that it kind of gets through your natural defenses, which I've always thought was a really interesting argument. I would not like to be, I've thought about this with telepathy, like I really do not want to read the minds of everyone in this room. And I doubt that you want to read the minds of everyone in this room either. It could be a really traumatic experience, or wonderful, everyone may love me. But, I think that there is some sense to this, which leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you was, if what we're talking about with life after death is kind of a continuance of mind or consciousness, what is life after death then? Is it just these sort of free-floating wisps of consciousness that we occasionally connect with? Is it something more coherent? Does your research actually let you say, here is my picture of what life after death might be? And going back to some of your research then, Kim, does it comfort you?
Well, there's another theory we didn't talk about, which is idealism, which is that mind is everything. This is all, the material world is just created by our consciousness. So there is, the idea could be that our afterlife, as we're calling it, is really the real life, and it's the main show, and being in these physical bodies is just sort of part of it. So from my research, like I said, am still searching. I don't have the answer. If anyone in the audience does, I would love to talk to you afterwards, or you can speak up now. What does comfort me is that, as I said, I'm fairly certain from the research I've done, from the data that exists in the literature and all the people that did the research before me, the folks at DOPS, people thousands of years before that, that there is more than the idea that we just live in this body and die and that's it. Our bodies disintegrate back to the earth and we're done. In fact, I think I've thought that ever since I was a little girl. I remember hearing about that and thinking, that seems a waste, doesn't it? You know, darn, you know. So my research really, to me, indicates that we exist in some way. We don't know quite yet exactly how that works. Maybe it's complicated physics. Maybe it's the creation of the universe. Maybe we'll never know, and I'm okay with that as well. I just love the search. And to me, it brings comfort. And to the people that I work with, the patients, the colleagues, the majority of them, it brings comfort as well to understand life this way.
Yeah, and I would say from looking at near-death experiences and then looking at our cases of past lives, it seems that there is an individual survival, that it's not just sort of entering the cosmic consciousness or whatever, but there is a fairly intact something that continues on, at least at the time of death, and then with our past life cases, it seems to continue. I didn't mention that 20% of these kids also talk about time between lives, experiences that they have after they died in the past life before they were born in this one. So again, there is this continuation, this individualized continuation that is certainly suggested by our work.
I have a couple more questions, and then we hope that you also have questions. There's a microphone in the center aisle here if you do want to ask Jim and Kim anything at all. I know they'd be happy to answer them. One of my questions is, if you take these experiences, in the what I think of as the institutional structure of science, theory, replication, confirmation, it seems to me that these are events that are very difficult to fit into that structure. I have no idea if I wanted to prove, for instance, that my father-in-law really was connecting in some way with his dead cousin, how would I prove that? What is there about the way science works that would allow me to establish that that was valid? And so I wonder, as you guys, situated as you are at a major research university, if you run into the fact that sometimes the work you do does not fit the sort of normal paradigms of science and how you try to overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it may be slightly quixotic in the sense that we're trying to take a scientific approach to material that may not lend itself to scientific approaches. But if we do things carefully, which we certainly try to do, then there is this empirical evidence that accumulates. So, with our 2,000 cases of past life memories and our 1,000+ cases of near-death experiences and everything else, there are patterns that develop that we can study, and it's not controlled laboratory studies, but it's something that needs an explanation. And yes, it doesn't fit into the mainstream materialist paradigm, so that means the paradigm may need to evolve or need to grow.
There you go, Kim.
Yes, and well, some of my research, I can do randomized control studies, looking at, you can teach people different meditative states. You can try to alter their states of consciousness in different ways and then explore the experiences they have. And so I think Jim is right that we are sort of skirting the edge of some of this. And some of our work is more qualitative, sort of collecting the stories. Again, science is an evolution and it's changing. And in my world, I see it changing to include more expansive approaches to things, more individualized research studies. Certainly in some of the BIPOC research that we do, we know we have to change the way we're doing science. We have to be more inclusive. We have to expand our methods not everything's going to fit into a randomized control trial. And that has been our standard. And that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think we need to look beyond that, as Jim said, and really be more inclusive. One of the things I want to honor is that none of this stuff we're talking about is new. And I don't want you to think that we're acting like we discovered it. This has been around in ancient cultures, in indigenous communities forever. So we also are, I feel strongly, are obligated to reach out to those people who have done this work, the shamans, the medicine men, the people who have this long history, and include them. And that's one of my goals as well in the work I'm doing, is to be more expansive in not just the scientific approach, but the people we include. If you think about it, we're living through, oh my God, I'm gonna get tearful here. I mean, we're living through a period of time where people are dying rapidly. COVID, the Ukraine, I would be remiss if I don't mention these things, and other genocides occurring. We need to work on how to help these people. I read a statistic that for every person who died from COVID, they're leaving an average of 9 people behind who will grieve them. So I feel very strongly that we've got a lot of work to do in this area, not just to understand what we're dealing with and explore that, but also to help the people that are left here to cope and deal and heal, and to honor the people that have done this work for centuries and include them and their wisdom.
That's a great note to end this part of the program with. I'm a journalist, so I could actually fill this entire hour with my questions, but I'm hoping some of you would like to come forward and ask a question. That's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate this conversation this morning. I have 2 questions. I guess the first one is, there's been some research that's been done on how things get encoded in our DNA, specifically grandchildren of people that went through the Holocaust or World War II that were starving, and typically it's through the grandmother, then it changes how they look at food. Question number 1, have you correlated that? Question number 2, on the conversations you've had with people that are having these experiences, of which I've had, but is it people that have died currently, or do people have things that can be 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, with that kind of, whether it's a moment that you're triggered, you see something that's the moniker or whatever. So 2 different questions. Thank you.
Well, I will try to answer them. So the first one, I am not an expert in that area of the sort of passing on the changes from trauma.
But there is some science there, but go ahead.
Absolutely, yes. Our colleague at the University of Virginia, Marisa Prey, has done a lot of that work looking at African Americans and the trauma passed down through their lineage and the effect on biology, so that is there. I think that would be fascinating. Jim might have done some of that with the children of who remember past lives, but I've not looked at that yet and would love to. And then the second question you had was?
The experiences that people are saying that they're feeling something or having evidence of, is it something that a person that passed recently, or can this linger and be decades later, years later, decades later?
Yes, it can be. That is the short answer, absolutely. People report, seeing a grandfather who they never even met, who died, 40 years earlier. So yes, absolutely, yeah. And we've even had people who see pets, so absolutely.
To get back to the first part, there have been studies not just with human trauma, but there have been studies with rodents where they'll associate, say, a shock with a fragrance. And what they find is that in the next generation, the rats show a fear, and even the generation after that. And it's thought to be what's called epigenetic, where it doesn't change the genes, but it changes which genes get turned on and that sort of thing. Yeah. That is not connected with our past life memory cases in the sense that most of the children are remembering a life where it's not an ancestor, but it's somebody separate. There's no genetic. And most of them recall recall the death, and of course people have passed on their genes obviously before they die, so there would not be that genetic connection.
Come on up.
This is fascinating. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask a perhaps controversial question. I wanted to ask if you have an opinion on organized religion. A lot of the things that you've mentioned might be described by many people as a heaven. I know that this is a scientific approach you're taking, but I just wondered if the religious perspective influenced any of your research.
Well, I think as far as the near-death experiences go, often afterwards the people are more spiritual, but not necessarily more religious. Some of them will talk with religious figures in their near-death experiences, but many do not. So, I mean, it doesn't confirm religion, but it's consistent with it. So there is more than that, just this physical reality, and people have conceptualized that in different ways. And again, many of the near-death experience folks do talk about seeing God or something like God. With our cases of past life memories, those cases are certainly easiest to find in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, so there would be sort of a religious thing, but they're found wherever anyone looks. And with the American cases, most of the families are Christian. They did not believe in reincarnation, and yet their children start talking about these past lives. So it sort of, if I may say this, it kind of transcends religion in a way, and is speaking sort of to, we might say, a higher truth.
Kim?
Yes, I would say the same. We always ask about religion, if they are religious, what religion they are. In most of my studies in meditation and in after-death communication, we ask that and find the same thing that Jim's talking about. Many people endorse changes, significant changes in their level of spirituality, what they describe as spirituality, and not necessarily in their religiosity, even if they endorsed that they were religious at the beginning. That doesn't seem to change significantly, either become more religious or less religious. It sort of stays the same. The spirituality increases.
I'm curious for the children who recall past lives, if you have information on follow-up studies with them as they age, become adults, does that fade or anything of that nature?
Yeah. Well, we are currently doing that study. We are interviewing adults who we originally studied as kids, since we've been doing this for so long. One thing we find is that the memories do tend to fade. So by the time the kids really are 6 or 7, most of them have stopped talking about this stuff and kind of gone on with their lives. But when you interview them as adults, a substantial minority say that they do still have some of those memories. They've just kind of stopped talking about them and gotten wrapped up in this life. And they seem to be doing fine. I mean, they're not psychotic or anything like that. They're just developing like the rest of us.
Just to jump in on that, Jim, why would the memories fade, do you think?
Well, it's the same age when we all lose our memories of early childhood. And the brain is undergoing a lot of changes during that time, pruning, which is sort of a long story, but we let a lot of the early stuff go. So, for any of us, if there's say a family friend that at age 2 or 3, the child definitely knows, I mean, it's in long-term memory, but if that person moves away, by the time the child is 5 or 6, they've usually forgotten them. So it makes sense that these memories would fade at the same time.
Makes sense. Come on up.
Hi. I presume you have very heated discussions with materialistic, skeptical colleagues. And I would like to hear what are your top 3 arguments that you give these these colleagues typically that are the essence of your work. And if there are experiences which are not 100% subjective, but there's also an objective part to it which can be kind of proven by outsiders. And if you have such experiences or yeah. Thank you.
Good question.
Tackle it first.
You can go first.
Okay. Well, it depends on, the skeptical argument depends on the area of work. So with the near-death experiences, the idea is, it's just the dying brain that is producing these experiences. But as far as we can tell, you may get an endorphin release, so the sense of calm. But these kinds of experiences, when the cortex that produces thought is completely shut down, and yet they're having the most profound experiences of their lives. People keep trying to come up with physical ways of explaining them away, but no one's come up with a convincing one yet. With the past life cases, the idea is that the kids are just kind of fantasizing, and then maybe the families make too much of it. So what we've got in a number of these cases, people have written down everything that the child said about the past life before anyone went to look to try to verify it. So if that's just all fantasy, it is one heck of a coincidence with some of the specifics they come up with.
Yes, and I would agree. It really depends on what topic we're talking about. When I started doing meditation research, I got a lot of flack from colleagues, and now, many of you may be aware, it's fairly mainstream, and there's a lot of, it's exponentially risen, the number of articles and manuscripts on that. So I'm waiting for some of this, honestly, to become mainstream over time. The arguments with respect to after-death communication, again, are very similar. It's a fantasy, it's not real. And the reality is that for some of these experiences, we will never be able to prove them. And for some of them, there are these experiences that can be validated. So there's about 20% of the after-death communications, there's information passed that we can verify. So things like information about, the password for a computer that someone needs to get into. And of course, information like that someone has passed on that you didn't know had died, and you're seeing them in the next world. And so there are some areas where we can challenge those questions. I think we're always going to run into that. That's what makes science. So I welcome that, and it makes our science stronger to be challenged that way, frankly. Thank you. That's a good question.
Yes, come on up.
First, I'm giant fangirl, Jim in particular, so welcome to Austin. I've been following your work for decades. I read Return to Life and Carol Bowman's book about children's past life memories a long time ago. And just in terms of personal effect, it made me less afraid of death, for sure. So I live life much more calmly about all this, so thank you. If nothing else, it produced that. But I also read Extraordinary Knowing by Elizabeth Mayer, if you guys are familiar with that work, UCSF. It was all about the skeptic's guide to all of this. And what she found is that she was doing research among her own academic peers because she had had her own kind of extraordinary experience, and that almost all of them, not all of them, many of them had some sort of experience like this, but then they really hid it because it would be completely shunned, and they were neurosurgeons, and they were highly credentialed people that if they told anybody about this would be laughed out of their work. And I remember thinking what a dramatic loss of capacity, right? That there's this way in which we'd be able to solve so much more complex problems, be able to have a much more open conversation. So I guess my question is, over all this period of time, have we shifted that needle? Are we opening up those doors more? Are we able to have much more? I mean, I'm also excited there's this many people here. But in academia in particular, that thing. There's another movie called The Man Who Knew Infinity. If you guys have seen that movie. Anyway, about mathematician Ramanujan who knew and was able to decode math in a way that, and then the lock between logic and provability and scientific method versus we just know,
Yeah.
right? And someday quantum, we can figure it out. So I guess I'm just wondering, you've been doing this work for a long time. So much of what you're talking about is familiar to me. Are we moving the needle? And will we be able to upload our consciousness someday?
Well, I think we are, although, like you say, it's hard to tell because people may not, we've moved the needle for them, but they won't admit it. But you never know who's open to this stuff, and you never know who's had these experiences. So, we're on committees in the hospital and so forth, and I will be shocked sometimes when this basic science person on the committee with me says, boy, I really enjoy your work and the work that Ian Stevenson did at UVA a long time ago before we got involved. So yeah, I think we're doing it sort of one person at a time. So it's kind of baby steps, but I think there is more openness to it than there was 50 years ago.
But it's not even about past life. It was impacting their current work in such profound ways that they couldn't tell anybody about it. They couldn't teach their students about it. They couldn't pass it on. And so all I'm saying is this work you guys are doing is really important in the ability to again, open up cognitive capacity for people to be able to solve much, much bigger stuff. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And to that point, there is a study that's now published that it's Cassie Veaton and a group out at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma. And they looked at, this was meditation and extraordinary experiences when you're meditating. And they had done an original study sort of looking at meditators out there versus non-meditators and showed this extraordinary number of experiences that people were having. And people poo-pooed, oh, there's a California folks, whatever. And so they said, no, okay, we're going to look and at a larger group. And they actually elicited scientists specifically. So scientists, engineers, and now it was all anonymous, and maybe that's the key. They had very similar reports of these extraordinary experiences. So I think you're absolutely right that they are happening to people. And when, that's why I said earlier when I introduced it, you have to feel safe with the person you're disclosing to. I have to help my patients, my colleagues feel safe to disclose, and they do. Now, do they make it public? No, and okay, that's fine. People can live their lives the way they want. I think it's exciting though that to even hear that people are reporting it more, and I think we are moving the needle, and so that is exciting.
Just like remove the stigma of mental illness, if we can remove the stigma and taboo around this.
That would be wonderful. And to the gentleman who asked about religiosity and spirituality, I mean, it would be interesting to see how those fold in. Do people who identify as more religious feel more comfortable or less comfortable sharing? What is that role? So I look at moderating factors too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's been a fascinating discussion. Come on up.
Okay. For those of us who are interested in this unique intersection of this work and the scientific method, who else should we be reading? You just mentioned one study out of Petaluma, but what else?
Well, Dean Radin at IONS at Noetic Sciences, he publishes a lot of very interesting stuff. That Sam Parnia, who's at Columbia, has published interesting stuff on time, the moment of death and how we even define death, as well as looking at near-death experiences.
And I think Deborah Blum, who has done a lot of work, not necessarily on near-death experiences, but on precognition. And he's a well-respected psychological scientist who has published in mainstream journals on the fact that if you look at the statistics, and these are randomized controlled trials, good old science, humans have precognition. We absolutely do. And so he's someone out there really putting his career on the line to publish in that arena.
Is he still at Cornell?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I was very curious to see if there were any commonalities or any through lines that you've discovered from the after-death communication as well as your work in past life experiences. And then secondarily, I had a question about contemplative methods, anything I can kind of begin to work on now that you might recommend?
Wonderful. So I will address that first, and then we'll go to the first question. I think any kind of contemplative practice is going to help set you up to sort of access more of these abilities. We did a study where we looked at undergraduates at the University of Virginia, about 500 of them, and it was an introductory class to Zen Buddhism, any Buddhism. So they did it was like a survey class. They learned about the ancient aspects, and then they learned modern day applications and practices. And just during that survey course, we assessed changes in the things we've been talking about: extraordinary experiences, compassion for others. That's another big one that is huge. And what we found is that just being exposed to it and practicing sort of minimally, they were meant to practice a couple days a week and keep track of it, and they shifted significantly. I was astounded. I didn't think they would. I mean, they're doing this as a course. They're not there to, get enlightened or anything, and yet they seem to have improved in these really extraordinary ways. So I would offer that. I mean, often what I encourage people to do is start with sort of a mindfulness meditation. There's so many apps out there now that you can access, and just really begin to, it's a sort of a standard attention focused, and then you can move into what we would call more of Vipassana, really sort of accessing that state of consciousness. There's just so many ways to get there. You're really looking for that state of consciousness, though. Yeah, and we can talk later. There's just so many options. It's wonderful. Thank you. And the first question?
Well, as far as through lines, I mean, I think sort of what I was saying earlier, that with all of these, there's this idea of an individual continuation. So with the after-death communications, it is the deceased individual who seems to be connecting. And the same with the past lives, remembering an individual moving through from one life to the next. So I would say that's the primary connection.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sophia. When I was a little girl, like really young, maybe around 4, I had this really intense fear of dying. And I would have these moments where my parents would say, let's go on a walk. And I was like, no, we can't, because we're gonna die if we do. And it was like really strong, but I felt like I couldn't tell them that. Like I was aware enough that I was like, if I say that, they're gonna be like, no, they just aren't gonna get it. And I think as I grew up, I kind of like pushed that to the back of my head. I was like, that's not something I need to worry about right now, but it was really still just like an underlying feeling that I had the whole time. And then when I was in college, I had a really intense psychedelic experience that kind of answered that. It was like an overlying question. I didn't go into the experience wondering, oh, maybe this will fix that fear, or like answer my question about like the state of consciousness. But it really did like completely absolve that fear that I had carried with me since I was a small child, which might have come from the fact that I had 3 surgeries before I was 2 years old, really intensive. So I think that was just like a very early stage of being close to that space. And I know that psychedelics are finally coming back kind of into more of a bit of a mainstream form of research, so I was wondering what your thoughts and perspectives are on that and how that might ultimately be useful. Because I know that my experience was just, like I didn't walk into that, and it certainly wasn't moderated, but that's what I got from it, and I'm glad I was in a safe space in order to go through that and had people with me who provided that space. But I'm just very curious to hear your perspective on what you think might be possible with that.
And that's a great question. We're almost out of time, so if you could be concise and we can get to the last question.
I will just say, yes, we are at the beginning of looking at that. I'm very interested in looking at the mostly the clinical applications, to be quite honest, because that does seem to be so promising for some of these intractable illnesses that people have. And the other aspect, very similar to meditative states and to contemplative practices, is looking at not only healing illness, but also augmenting wellness. And and both if we can. And so yes, I hope to move into that area. Right now we are not doing research with psychedelics.
But there has been a study done, not by us, but a study done looking at death anxiety among cancer patients, and one dose of psilocybin removes their death anxiety. So yeah, that, as Kim said, that work is coming. Psychedelics in psychiatry are exploding. So,
Thank you.
Good question. Okay. Take it away.
The beauty of coming to South by Southwest is that you get involved into all sorts of discussions, and it's a convergence of minds. 3 years ago or so, I was attending a session that talked about that we were living in a simulation. And for the materialists in the room, the engineers, right, suddenly they are moving into this environment that is about religion, that is about consciousness and psychism. Are you seeing types like engineer, geeky types engage with you guys on a conversation that usually, historically, they wouldn't?
Well, we have an engineer at DOPS, so absolutely. And I think, as I said, as we grow in sophistication of our knowledge of physics, especially, and some of these components, and biology also, that we are getting into really interesting conversations. And as Jim indicated, you know, we are with mainstream scientists and researchers all the time. And we're very well tolerated, I have to say. Some of them even like us. So that, I think, helps, having colleagues, having relationships to do that work and bridge those gaps. Absolutely. Thank you.
So perhaps this is a conversation about the metaverse after all.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and as far as conversation goes, I'm going to put in a plug for us. So with the website, you can sign up. We have an e-newsletter that people can sign up for if they want to learn about our work going on, and also we have we're on Facebook, and what else? Maybe that's it.
I think Twitter, all of those things. If you go to the website, you will find that information, and it's up here on the big screens for you. So we would love to have you contact us, and we really do appreciate you being here. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Jim and Kim. This has been fascinating. You guys have been a wonderful group. And if you have any unanswered questions, I'm sure that Jim and Kim would be happy to stay for a few minutes and talk to you directly. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.